Good afternoon, everybody. It is great to see you here, and welcome to the first of our Global and Area Perspectives Symposia. I'm John Ciorciari. I'm the Dean of the Hamilton Lugar School, and I'm just delighted to see you all here. The reason why we collectively decided to launch this series of events, Global and Area Perspectives Symposia, is first and foremost because we wanted to show the value of area studies to illuminate complex global issues or challenges. In this case, the theme of our symposium, as you all know, is migration, something that affects people in all parts of the world, and is sometimes studied solely at sort of this high level at the international plane without really getting into the details about how migrant experiences vary from region to region, about how different laws, customs, regulations, cultural norms might affect migrant experiences and patterns in various parts of the world. And so we want to use this as an opportunity to showcase something that we see as a unique strength of the Hamilton Lugar School, Indiana University more broadly, which is this ability to fuse international and area studies. And again, to be able to use area studies expertise to shed light on complex global issues. That'll be very much on display today and tomorrow. We have participation from a wide range of Indiana University departments and units, contributing panelists or organizers or funds to the symposium. These include the African Studies Program, our Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, our East Asian Studies Center, our Institute for European Studies and Polish Studies Center, Center for Refugee Studies, Southeast Asian Studies Program, our Inter-Asian and Uralic National Language Center, Resource Center, our Center for the Study of Global Change, the Burns Russian and East European Institute, the DAR India Studies Program, the Tobias Center for Innovation and International Development, and many departments here at IU Bloomington, as well as IU in Indianapolis, including East Asian languages and cultures, linguistics, anthropology and gender studies, political science, folklore and ethnomusicology, comparative literature, education, and social work. I've probably missed a handful, but you get the idea that the breadth of expertise on this campus across disciplines, including but not limited to the humanities and social sciences, can be brought to bear through our area studies programs in shedding useful light on migration. Of course, we also want Indiana University to engage with and welcome leading scholars from around the world. And this weekend, we're privileged to have experts visiting us from leading universities around the country, going roughly from east to west. We have experts visiting us from the City University of New York, the University of Maryland, Rhodes College, Boise State, Cal State Fullerton, UC Irvine. We also have graduate students who are presenting papers from here at Indiana University, and we had a few signed up to come from Michigan and from Northwestern as well, although they each unfortunately have contracted COVID and out of a sense of responsibility have decided to sit this one out. So we have a really rich community of people gathered to study this important theme of migration. Before I get started on the substantive outline of the symposium, let me just thank Heather Doomling, as well as Ethan Hamilton for their great work organizing the symposium. I also want to thank our events and communications team, IU Conferences, and the students who have helped us to organize the symposium. We have many campus partners, as you gather from the long list of affiliated centers and departments I mentioned, but I want to point out one other, which is here in front of me, our Vice President for International Affairs at IU, Hannah Buxbaum, and their office across the street from us, which is a vital partner, not just to the Hamilton Lugar School, but more broadly to all of the international and area studies units operating here and elsewhere in the IU system. So thank you, Hannah, for your office's vital work in this area. So what are we going to do in the symposium? In essence, we're going to start with our keynote address by Tariq Roland Riebl in a moment, presenting kind of a global view of migration and some of the broad patterns, themes, challenges, and opportunities that exist. We're then going to shift to a series of panels engaging experts from the departments and universities I've just mentioned to talk about different aspects of migration, in particular regional locales. We're starting with a panel that's going to look at political leadership and the sources of migration, particularly in Africa and Latin America. Tomorrow morning, we'll shift to look at what happens to migrants when they reach the border, literally or metaphorically, and study a little bit about asylum rules and regulations in various East Asian societies. We'll then look inside of countries where refugees have resettled and look at the reception to migrants, including but not limited to refugees in various European polities. And then we'll end by talking about what happens when refugees or other migrant communities become well settled and domiciled in a given area, like here in Indiana, and talk about questions of cultural and linguistic preservation with a focus on the Chin community in Indiana as well as others here in the United States. And so there's meant to be sort of an arc following migrants along their journeys from their places of origin to their ultimate destinations and places of resettlement. And we hope that through these various interdisciplinary lenses and different regional lenses that we'll be able to come out of the symposium with a much richer understanding of some of the many faces of the human experience of migration. And there's no better place to start than with our keynote address. We are privileged to have Tariq Riebl, who's come across the Atlantic from his home base in London at the Norwegian Refugee Council, where he is the Global Program Strategy and Innovation Director. Tariq has directed humanitarian response efforts in more than 15 countries over nearly 20 years for the United Nations, for the International Rescue Committee, for Oxfam, and for Médecins Sans Frontières. And he's worked in crises ranging from civil war in Yemen to droughts and Ebola outbreaks in various parts of Africa to typhoon in the Philippines. Alongside this hands-on efforts that he's led to respond to humanitarian strife, he's also a leading policy advocate on issues including migration, which of course is driven in no small part by the types of crises to which he and others have responded. Educated at Georgetown and the London School of Economics, he's based, as I said, in London. He's regularly featured in world media and is an influential voice on refugee policy, which makes him an ideal person to kick off our symposium with a broad perspective on some of the many challenges and opportunities that we face in this era of large-scale human migration. And so in a moment, I'll welcome Tariq to the podium. He'll offer remarks for 20-25 minutes and then leave lots of time to engage in conversation with you and question and answer. So Tariq, welcome to Indiana University and the Hamilton Lugar School. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for the very warm welcome. Beautiful campus, my first time in Indiana and at this university, and it's been really wonderful so far. I'm really privileged to have the chance to speak to you to open this symposium, and I will be focusing on the humanitarian perspective on migration. So we could talk about climate migration, economic migration, mixed migration. I'll focus a bit on forcibly displaced persons, give you sort of a landscape of where things are, the state of play, and some of the key issues we're facing. In your questions, though, feel free to go beyond things I may mention, because we could spend hours, obviously. First of all, if you look at the figures, overall, we're looking at almost 120 million people who are forcibly displaced. That's a doubling in the last 5 years. And I can tell you that 5 years ago, we thought 60 million was bad. That was a historic high. We've doubled that in 5 years. So we're trending in the wrong direction. You can also see the different categories. The two distinct ones to focus on here are refugees, people leaving a country to go to another country under a protected status that is guaranteed by the UN Refugee Agency, or should be. But the bulk, and more than half at this point, of people are actually internally displaced in their countries, fleeing conflicts from one area to another, and therefore vulnerable because the parties to the conflict may be still very proximate to them. Looking at the regions and countries of origin, no surprises here. You can see Middle East, North Africa, and then the Horn of Africa, the Great Lakes. For those of you who don't know, Great Lakes, Congo, Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, but principally Congo. And here the countries, again, no surprises here. You can see Syria, Sudan, Ukraine, etc. And then there are countries like Afghanistan where war has been constant for almost 40 years. Most of these categories are trending upwards, most of the people and the regions. And the Middle East right now is, of course, of extreme concern. Just quickly here, in terms of internally displaced persons, you can see as well, and I would ask you to focus especially on Sudan. Sudan is a number that already is gargantuan after just 18 months of war. Probably is an underestimate because we just don't have enough means to verify numbers. But we consider half the country, so about 26 million people, in need of assistance of some kind, and a famine that may be the worst since Ethiopia in '84, about to really take place. And just quickly here, to compare with the refugees again, you can see the bubbles. Besides Venezuela, you will see that most are also in those same areas. That means that our system is overwhelmed, the humanitarian system. We can't cope with 120 million people, and that's not counting all the people affected by other disaster types, right? So we have people on the move, stuck, often in desperate situations, and then a humanitarian system that is supposed to respond, but we can't respond to those numbers, and we also can't influence the governments where people are being hosted. We used to have a concept that we call, or we still call, durable solutions, which is basically looking at how can we help people that flee conflict. There are three principal ways of conceiving of this. One is that you stay where you've moved to and resettle with a new life. A third is that you get repatriated to a third country, often far away from your conflict point of origin. And then the third one is returning to your place of origin, which is often romanticized, but in reality never happens. And I think is one of the big problems that we face, that people push for this because it's the easiest for many of the affected governments dealing with these caseloads, but in reality, this is not a real choice. So it is about resettlement or repatriation. And we have never-ending conflicts everywhere, right? You can see all across the world. There are plenty of places that people don't talk about as much. Myanmar could erupt at any moment. Venezuela has been a huge source of refugees and internally displaced people. You have a country like Congo, which for 30 years has been producing larger and smaller conflicts as a constant. We also have new phenomenon. I would point out the phenomenon of gangs in Latin America, and I would include Haiti. That's the picture on the left. Haiti is essentially falling into a state of violence that we wouldn't actually conceive of as civil war necessarily, because there aren't necessarily political parties to the conflict that are the biggest cause of violence. It's actually gangs. And we see the same happening in places like most of the Central American countries. Even in Colombia, one of the biggest sources of violence now is the Gulf Clan, a very shadowy organization that controls much of the cocaine production at this point, and has no real political goal, but is the source of huge displacement inside the country and violence. Despite all of this, we see that natural disasters and epidemics resonate more with the wider public and with the classic donor countries and donor community. So we are seeing that many people are not really picking up on these conflicts and not both maybe giving them the attention they deserve, nor the money that they need in order for us to respond, unless there is a political stake. So we see a lot of coverage, for example, right now about Ukraine and about Palestine. But like I mentioned, the biggest conflict by far is Sudan. And when was the last time you saw an in-depth report on Sudan? I would also say here, point you to a report that the Norwegian Refugee Council will bring out once a year called the Neglected Crises Report, which is exactly trying to draw attention to this with at least some press work when we issue it. And if you look at the 10 countries here, again, most of these rarely feature in the press, Burkina Faso has been number one for several years. When was the last time you referred to that country? And this is the problem. You will also see a real clustering. Most of our neglected crises, 9 of them are essentially sub-Saharan Africa in a very thin corridor of Africa, where again there's very little political attention, very little political interests outside of regional powers, and very little media coverage and press coverage. Some level of fatigue as well. Countries like South Sudan that have been in war for so long that we kind of have gotten used to it probably. When we do respond, we have access impediments. At NRC, we categorize this using what we call a hard-to-reach scaling from 1 to 5. And anything above 3 is already considered constrained access, but even 2 can be difficult to work in. And we're seeing some places with very high proportions of the people we work in, anything above 40% is considered extraordinary. And right now, for example, Gaza is 100%, not a single person that we want to work with is accessible. What is important here is as well, we have 3 categories. 2 of them will be very obvious to you. The first one is logistics, so basically bad roads, possibly airports or helipads. Much of sub-Saharan Africa is like that. If you've had the joy of driving in Congo or Central African Republic, you will know that it's very slow. One project I worked in Congo-Brazzaville, we used to drive for 60 kilometers, 4 hours. The second one is security and conflict, fairly obvious, but the third one is actually the biggest one, which is what we call bureaucratic and administrative impediments, BAI. And that is something like this, the border crossing of Rafah, where you will spend days, hours, weeks trying to get in. In Sudan right now, we have up to 29 people waiting for visas to enter. In Myanmar, we basically can't enter right now. Even when you're inside a country, you may need permits to move, you may need permits to import relief goods, you may need permits to buy a car, and you may not be able to get these as easily as a commercial a vendor or a private person. And these impediments are being used more and more in a very systematic way. Following World War II, we actually had a whole way of conceiving of providing humanitarian assistance, specifically in conflicts. The Geneva Conventions in 1949 allow unconstrained access to all humanitarian actors. And no party to the conflict, whether state or non-state, should be impeding this. But the reality is we live in an age of impunity. Here are just a few of the current ones, but I could have put 20 up there. These are more recognizable ones. Draw your attention also, the fact I put the White House. I didn't put a face because I think this is one thing which is bipartisan, unfortunately. Even the US government has often been difficult to collaborate with on humanitarian access, and that's something that we call them out on. And even in conflicts like Yemen, where I was as well, there was active support of one of the parties of the conflict at the time, both in terms of weapons, but also in terms of not actively trying to control access. You may also not recognize one person on here, Paul Kagame. Of all the current African strongmen, probably the one singularly most responsible for a lot of violence that's happening. And again, not someone that features necessarily in that way, except for people that follow closely, because he's largely seen as a darling in terms of international development and the success Rwanda has had on that. When there isn't conflict, there's climate. I've decided not to talk too much about climate because I didn't want to spend, again, hours on all the different types of displacement we could talk about. Feel free to ask me questions about that. But one of the key issues is maybe the conflict has been resolved, but then you're facing like one of the worst places to live in terms of climatic conditions. So Afghanistan, for example, in terms of conflict, is seen probably its biggest period of peace for many decades, probably 40 years at least. but has a horrific climatic outlook with drought zones, flood zones, harsh winters, hotter summers, and so forth, it becomes difficult then to talk about things like durable solutions for people even being displaced within the country, and even if the fighting that has been persistent in that country has gone down. I know it's very bleak, so I thought I'd finish up on something a bit more positive. One book I would recommend that everyone read is not by a humanitarian, which probably means it's good, is Arrival City by Doug Saunders, written about 15 years ago, a journalist. And he looks at 20 communities in different cities around the world on all continents. It specifically examines here migration that is actually point-to-point. In my current hometown, the place of my birth, London, he mentions Brick Lane, which is famous for its Bangladeshi community. Vibrant community over many decades now, lots of curry houses, very popular tourist destination if you go to London. And Brick Lane, for example, has built a steady stream of migration over decades where people from specific communities in Bangladesh have been going for a long time. And essentially, they've developed a way of a pathway of migration into London and into the UK. You enter Brick Lane. There's a set of jobs that you can take. That even if you don't speak perfect English, you can get your way in, make a bare bones minimum wage. There's locations where you can house 10 people in one bedroom so that you can save money, send back remittances. After a few years, you graduate out of that in inverted commas and you start moving up and you take a better job. But the real quantum shift is for the next generation, the children, many of whom do become doctors, dentists, lawyers, and so forth. And that's what a lot of people are working towards. In many ways, if you look at the first years in Brick Lane for people that arrive there, you wouldn't say that this is a very positive way of entering a country. You're working long hours, you're squatting with, like I said, 10 people maybe in a one bedroom. You're sending most of your money back home. You're definitely not flying back home anytime soon, even if you have a partner and kids back home, because you don't want to waste money on a plane ticket. It can be lonely. But what is positive here is that there's an outlook that is positive. He shows other communities like that. Interestingly, in South Central Los Angeles, in Compton, there's an El Salvadoran stream that has been going for many years where similar sort of positive patterns have emerged. And he points out here that sometimes we get stuck by the perception that that condition as a snapshot is quite negative. What is interesting as a concept of an arrival city is the through flow. And that is what you need to focus on. The example he gives is someone in Sao Paulo who had been, going to the favelas there for many years, commented at one point, I find it so depressing that I come here year after year, and every year I see the same conditions, terrible sanitation, people squatting in these terrible shacks, having poor jobs. And one of the people from that community actually looked at him and smiled and said, "I think you've misunderstood what's going on here." He said, "What do you mean?" He said, "No, this favela does look like this and has been looking like this and probably will look like this for the next few decades. But the person in each shack is not the same. They're rotating. So you're looking at a snapshot, but it's not a static snapshot. It's dynamic. And people are there for a couple of years. They're entering Sao Paulo. Again, they're working as hard as they can, trying to save up money, trying to invest. Then they move out. And the important point is the dynamism. Where that doesn't happen, you fall into a trap. And this is, for example, in the Paris banlieues, where people from West Africa, North Africa enter and are even geographically and physically trapped in these big buildings. And you will see that people don't move on from there, often don't even speak good French, even after being there for 20 years. They're just not integrated. That same sort of pathway that Bangladeshis in Brick Lane or Salvadorans in Compton have found doesn't seem to have worked there. This is where we should be questioning policymakers and saying, don't view migrants as a problem, view them as an opportunity. Going back to and applying this to the humanitarian context, this is what the poverty trap, this is what the migration trap looks like. This is Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, the biggest refugee camp in the world, almost 1 million people. This is how people are living there, and this is just a tiny photo. It goes on for, miles and miles and miles. This is Bidi Bidi camp in Uganda. And when I went to Uganda a few years ago, I didn't go to Bidi Bidi, but to similar camps. The Ugandan government, which, for all its faults, of which there are very many, has done an extraordinary thing where they, many years ago, decided to allow any refugee, anyone who enters their country, to have their plot of land, have full tenured rights. And it's extraordinary when you go to those camps, and I've been to camps in that entire region, in Congo and Burundi, etc. Congo and Burundi, it looks a lot like that last picture I showed you. In Cox's Bazar, people, in squalor, close up, desperate. Here, you can just see even the geographic distance between the houses. And everyone there owns that plot of land. And you'll see people growing things. And when you talk to people, you see a level of relief, a level of calmness, because they know at least they have this roof. And even if they can't work all the time, they have somewhere they can sleep, and it's their land. And if they grow something there, no one's going to come and take it away from them. No one's going to seize the land. No one's going to make a big condo development out of it. It's their land. Simple policy, but a huge impact in terms of what it can do. This is one of the Norwegian Refugee Council's program in Uganda. These are kids doing school gardening around the school, again, plot of land that belongs to them, so they can garden. So basically what I want to say is that can we view migration like this, where we give people an opportunity, give them dignity, rather than getting them into traps, be it in the banlieue in Paris, be it in Cox's Bazar, be it in Dadaab, refugee camp in Kenya, where people don't exit, and where we then blame them because we haven't even given them an opportunity to advance, when we could have done fairly straightforward things like have been done in Brick Lane or in Compton or in Uganda. I'll leave it at that. And open it up for questions. And feel free to go beyond anything I spoke about. Again, I know I narrowed the subject of migration quite a bit, but I thought it would be
I should have said we have a few handheld mics. If you wouldn't mind, when you put your hand up, to wait for the microphone and then share your name and your affiliation.
Thank you so much. Kelly Berkson, IU. You made a comment on an early slide about people, entities, paying more attention to pandemics and natural disasters. Would you be willing to speak a little more on that?
Sure. So I've worked in all of those. I worked in the West Africa Ebola pandemic and in the biggest Congolese one a few years ago, plus COVID. Several natural disasters, but you could also think of the Nepalese earthquake or Haiti earthquake and so on. I don't know what it is, but it just captures people's imaginations, right? Like the images are sort of, people get, you can see the media attention. In the UK, there's a committee, the Disaster Emergency Committee, that launches appeals. I mean, those appeals for natural disasters or the Ebola crisis in a few days have collected tens of millions of pounds. And the same happens in the US and so forth. Donor governments usually give lots of money. You think about all the aid given to different earthquakes and so on. The Ebola West Africa response. With conflicts, it just doesn't seem to resonate. There doesn't seem to be that empathy. There are exceptions, like Ukraine clearly was an exception, Gaza. But like I said, I feel there's a political connection there, right? There's a stake that a lot of people have, possibly also kinship that people draw. Like I said, for us, the number one neglected crisis, Burkina Faso, and I mean, when did you hear a report about Burkina Faso? But even Sudan, I mean, Sudan is horrifying. But even when I look at Latin America, I was just in Colombia. I mean, like the Gulf Clan, things like that. People are not talking about these phenomena. So we struggle with it. We try and work on our media work, but again, it's difficult. I mean, you'll have all of our CEOs and so on going into all the war zones, trying to garner media attention, and it'll last for 24 hours and then dissipate and fall back off the radar. We think one of the key issues is, of course, that, and here I'll open up a whole other box, is if we look at political trends in general around the world. I was having lunch with some colleagues and talking about the fact that many years ago we used to talk about the responsibility to protect principle, R2P, which was basically after Rwanda and Bosnia saying never again, and let's constrain state sovereignty in order to, and even call it into question where a state is willfully and directly harming its population. Because of the guilt felt for not intervening. I mean, nowadays you hear nothing about R2P at all, and quite the contrary. You see that again, I think some cases there's an interest not to want to draw attention to conflicts because there's then the onus to have to intervene diplomatically, intervene possibly with a peacekeeping mission, obviously send money in, but then also receive people. And this is the big one, right? Like, we do not want more migrants in most of the countries around the world. And that's a sad truth. The demonization is happening at all levels. It's happening in the global north and global south, east, west, all continents in the same way. And even some governments that have been progressive on this, for example, Colombia has been quite progressive in many ways. Even they are questioning, have we done too much? Should we constrain ourselves and so forth, right? But there isn't sort of a sense of solidarity, I think, and but somehow we feel it for an earthquake. So, sorry.
Thank you so much for the wonderful words. Very clear thesis. I was trying to wrap my mind around really shocking data that you showed on accessibility. And so I was hoping you could speak a little bit more to that. You're specifically speaking about how many people, the access to impediments. Could you maybe just dive in a little bit more as sort of how, is this just the targets that you've set, and how does this look sort of globally, et cetera? My question is not as clear as your thesis has been, but
No, this is nerd territory now, so you open Pandora's box. This is a big debate, but essentially we're cautious about using this too much. It's an internal tool, but basically what we want to say was, if we compare and contrast contexts, which ones are ones that are fairly easy to work in and which ones are fairly difficult, and why. And so we said we hear a lot of subjectivity, a lot of impressions from the ground. They're often colored by emotions, sometimes by inexperience, sometimes of a lack of context in a comparative manner, right? Most conversations with colleagues in the field start with, you've never seen anything as bad as this, to which you inhale and say, actually, probably yes, unfortunately. So that was sort of the very straightforward way. But we also wanted to start looking at some of these trends that we were talking about. Are things really getting worse, yes or no? And how are they getting worse? And so our team who work on access, who actually one of the teams I directly line manage, they started thinking about this over many years, and there are three categories that emerged. So logistics, conflict, and then bureaucratic and administrative impediments. And again, so conflict and logistics are very graphic and easy to understand, right? And so we also are easy, it's easy to describe them, easy to quantify. The one that really became, though, the most important in almost all the areas we work in is bureaucratic and administrative impediments. And this was initially something that was less prominent, but then certain states have been entrepreneurial in developing quite excessive systems of control. And interestingly, we started seeing other states referencing these states, actually. So they are seen as sort of having pioneered strategies that are then used. And so you will start seeing this sort of the same patterns. So it starts with the visas, and then it goes into huge amounts of sort of Orwellian bureaucracy and bureaucratic language, and then sometimes into complete lack of access. You think about Sri Lanka in 2009, during the final campaign, they literally asked every humanitarian agency to leave. When they didn't, then they ordered them and said, we will carpet bomb you with everyone else. And those sorts of strategies happen all over the world at this point. So you start seeing them being used in a very precise manner. So sort of knowing that we are often on the front line, and unlike journalists, we remain close. So when I'm in a country, I'm not there for 2 days to do a story, I'll be there for 6 months. And we're dealing with all these populations, right, that are not necessarily politically connected. So we're gathering testimonies and witnessing things and so forth. And they're also sort of, so that is one of the big concerns, the witnessing. Place where that became really apparent was when the media isn't present. For me, that was Yemen. When I was in Yemen at the outset of the civil war in 2015, I couldn't believe that no one was talking about this, which was one of the worst aerial bombing campaigns of all time, I would say. It was incredible. I would have airstrikes for 5 hours at a time, every single day. 5 hours every 45 seconds an airstrike, you know. And that was just Sana'a or just Taiz or one of the cities where I was. Our other teams were reporting simultaneously across the country every day. And that happened for probably 6 months to a year. And with the US doing the aerial refueling so that, you know, it was a conveyor belt of planes. For people that don't know, the Saudi Air Force is the world's second largest. Yes. It also has more Eurofighters and more Typhoons than any European country. And it has more tornadoes than the Royal Air Force of Britain. So just to put things in perspective in that way. But then there was no coverage. People weren't even talking about it. And so I think we started seeing also how far these access constraints go, and then also being unable to talk and raise awareness. You will see this is very complicated because you can argue about almost every single country. Like I said, one that's fairly straightforward is Gaza, but on many others you could do plus minuses. These are also based only on the areas of the country we work in, and we don't obviously as an organization work in every affected part of every country. So it's skewed. So we don't use it too much publicly. In this forum, I think it's really interesting, but it's just need to think about this.
Hello, my name is Georgia Pollard. I'm a fourth year here at HLS. You mentioned state sovereignty and the R2P principle earlier in your response. I was wondering if you could expand more on how these crackdowns on borders and growing anti-immigration sentiments have affected efforts to help these migrants and also refugees.
So some of it's not new at all, right? So I mentioned briefly, I alluded to Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya, before Cox's Bazar, for many years the biggest refugee camp. Initially, Somalis arrived there in 1991. There are many Kenyan Somalis, so they're not random people in that sense. There's actually quite a lot of Kenyan Somalis. In 2024, people who live in Dadaab still don't have a right of citizenship, nor even of permanent residency outside of Dadaab. So there are people who, since 91, there have obviously been waves. Not everyone's been there for 30 years, but there are lots of people born in Dadaab. There's a whole generation of kids and teenagers that have been born in Dadaab. And they're not considered Kenyan, they're not even considered residents of the country. So this has been going on for many years, and I could give you plenty of other countries as examples. I think what we now see is that across the world, there's a concerted sort of voice. In the global north, this has risen to extraordinary levels, right? Like, so in 2015, Germany, my home country, let in 1 million Syrians, which essentially has led to the rise of the AfD now. And Merkel knew, it's quite extraordinary, she said, I know this will cost me, the future, essentially, of my government. She still did it, so, that's one of the very rare examples of political courage, if you want to call it that, where someone said, I know that I will lose elections because of this, but I'm going to do it because it's the right thing. But we don't see that elsewhere, right? For the most part, Canada, a little bit, but again, Canada geographically is quite removed from, it's not easy for people to get there, right? They have to be flown in. So I find it quite extraordinary in the global south as well, how this is happening, how harsh governments have become in their rhetoric, in their language, and in their policies. So I think what's extraordinary is that country after country, and again, I mentioned some of the exceptions, Uganda, Colombia, but they're easy to mention because they're so few and far between. So I think what's extraordinary is this rise, and then that sort of course, becomes an echo chamber where people are hearing each other saying the same things for political expediency. So there's no reason then for you who's going to step out and be different. So I think that notion of sovereignty, of course, also then plays into what I meant with R2P, which is that when do we infringe on a state's right to essentially kill people at scale? And we didn't see it happen in Syria. We didn't see it happen in, almost any other conflict. But, right now we have several conflicts ongoing where it's extremely stark. And what we witness, I think Gaza, of course, is shocking, but there's many others. And then this now almost, the question of sovereignty isn't even being challenged anymore. It's just a given, regardless. And I think 30 years ago, I guess, time, when R2P was sort of, something that people were talking about, it was like, no, sovereignty isn't just a gift forever. It's something that also needs to be earned by values and human rights, sort of, following human rights. So I think, are we going to go back? Sometimes these pendulums swing, and maybe we swing back to, maybe there's another event like Bosnia or Rwanda that captures the imagination. Although we have plenty that fit that category. I mean, even Ukraine, for all the criticisms we can level about disproportionate support and so forth, like 1 million people have died in that conflict, right? In Europe, not Africa, like not some small country, like in Europe, 1 million people. That's extraordinary. Plus, all the millions have been displaced and entire cities leveled. So that sort of, propensity to violence is definitely coming back in a big way. But I think I think sovereignty is a key notion here in terms of how we question.
I am a resident of Bloomington and alumna from IU a couple of times. My question has to do with the U.S. policy of providing foreign aid with the alleged goal to help where it is as opposed to dealing with it within our own borders. So can you talk to that as to whether that is effective at all, or are we throwing money out the window?
Oh, wow. This is a can of worms because although I'm a humanitarian myself, I'm very critical of our work as well. And we've not been good custodians often in many places. I think that's very fair to say. So for all its failings, the US government is the #1 donor of humanitarian aid in total volume, right? Obviously proportionate to GDP and so forth. It isn't, but in absolute terms, it is by far. And that's great. And there are other countries that definitely don't seem to consider that important. We can think about all the rising ones, the Middle Eastern ones, China. They are not giving, India, they're not giving a lot of money. So that is something that is important. The distribution is sometimes very politicized. So obviously Ukraine comes to mind, but then also who doesn't get, essentially, right? The Central African republics of the world that just don't get the same money. So the money is not necessarily being distributed by need, but by political attention, sort of that's that the crisis has. Or if there's a specific lobby group interested in pushing a certain cause over another. I think the bigger issue is that the humanitarian system, and I didn't mention this explicitly, I don't think the humanitarian system should be dealing with displacement beyond the initial outsets of conflicts. And I feel the failings are much more that by allowing us to have to deal with this, our skill set is too limited for the long-term needs that people need, because they're not humanitarian in nature. They're about macroeconomic questions, microeconomic questions. They're about how do you set up urban communities with X amount of new people that have joined? How do you register all these people? How do you include them in social safety nets and social protection systems? How do you create jobs for everyone and education and enough? How do you broaden the healthcare sector and so forth, right? And humanitarians are basically doing stopgap measures, sometimes filling the role, so we become a Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, and so forth, but we shouldn't do that over the long term. So maybe one thing that needs to happen is that we divert the attention from actors such as the organization I work for and towards the instruments of development and so forth that can then deal with people in a more structural way. And these are discussions that happen between the humanitarian and the development sector, but I think need to be more forcefully pushed, also in the way money is allocated. So for example, Dadaab, after 33 years, is still being funded by humanitarian funding pots, and the recipients are humanitarian agencies. Why isn't it considered a city in Kenya with 600,000 people? You know, but it isn't. It's still considered a humanitarian caseload. The other question is then, of course, and I think the EU and Turkey would be maybe what you're also alluding to, are we funding Turkey to keep Syrians in Turkey because we don't want them moving further north? And the answer is yes. I mean, we know because, they said that, everyone said that. But is that good then for the Syrians in this case, right? And so I think that's where it then becomes difficult. Some of it's about geography. The US is dealing with people from Venezuela because Venezuelans have direct access, if you will, through the Americas, and people from Africa don't. So then the issue is it good to fund where it's happening? Yes, but like I said, maybe with some different ways of doing it. Can it be done in order not to have to deal with the problem at home? Yes, although a lot of that's linked to geography. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but to some extent.
Hello, Martha Nikas, School of Education. I'd like to turn our conversation a little bit more towards a more hopeful note. One of the things I noted that you mentioned was that we fail to view migrants as assets, and I'd like you to elaborate a little bit more on that, particularly thinking about those of us here who are in the academy who are trying to do our best to educate and to also bring these kinds of issues to our students' attention. And I want to particularly commend the Norwegian Refugee Council. I repeatedly hear it on the news, and it is one of my hopeful notes to find that a more obscure country, if you will, is trying to do a lot of good. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Ultimately, migration is nothing new, right? I mean, all of us are descendants of migrants in some form. It just depends how far back you go, with some exceptions. So I think it's more about realizing why do some migrants succeed and why others don't. And like I said, I think I love the Rival City book because it's looking at 20 different cities across all continents. So it's really not about some sort of, regional, unique exceptionalism or anything like that. And I think ultimately it's about providing, understanding what someone arriving in a new place needs, which is, first of all, empathy and dignity, but second of all, a very practical things such as being registered. One of the things we do is what we call legal protection, which is a very boring term for a very important thing, which is about trying to get people birth certificates, trying to get them ID cards, trying to get them registered, and so forth. It can be so terrible for you if you are working without ID, because you just can't even apply for jobs, you can't get a bank account, you can't rent. Simple things like that have a huge impact. I think also one of the important things is to realize how most migrants want to help themselves, but somehow are viewed as dependency burdens. And I think it then becomes this tautology and a self-fulfilling prophecy, because by not enabling them to enter into, for example, learning a language or having a job, well, they become a dependency, which then reinforces the notion that they are a dependency. So we have to break this tautology and this vicious circle and basically say, let's give them a chance and let's identify what they need. Also, let's identify what they don't need. So an interesting example is the World Bank in Mumbai a few years ago decided to take a slum and raise it to the ground and erect a really nice apartment building and give the deeds of those apartments to the inhabitants of the slum. They came back a year later, not a single of the inhabitants was living in those apartments. They'd all rented them out or sold them. So they went back to the people and said, I mean, do you not like the apartment? Like, it's so nice and so forth. They're like, yeah, but it's too nice. Like, I am at my level of economic development, this is a disproportionate expenditure or a disproportionate cost. I can use that income that I can make from renting or selling the place to invest in making a little business or investing in the education of my kids. That is more important right now than living in a fancy place. So sometimes we're also projecting things onto people, right? And like I said, this like the person saying, man, this favela in Sao Paulo, what a trap. It doesn't have to be a trap if the person can save all this money by just living on very poor sort of living costs for a while. So I think it's also about really scrutinizing and talking to people and saying, what do you need, but also what don't you need? What are the sort of things that we could waste money on? One simple thing that we also have to work a lot on is language. Language is a huge impediment because you can't participate in the economy, kids can't go to school, they need to be in parallel schools, they can't join like a school of that country just because they don't have the language. So there are very specific things that can help. And then there's some things that we might think are nice, but actually cosmetic. So I think that's the policy. That's where policy needs to be smart. I think we're done. One more. One more.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I'd like to ask you a little bit about the notion of indigeneity, ethnic minorities. We talk about sovereignty and we talk about nation states, but so many times the people who are being displaced are people who don't necessarily recognize themselves as part of that nation state. They're actually nations within nations. Can you speak to how that shapes the work?
Not in 1 minute. But yeah, I mean, no, I completely agree. And this is where, do we view citizenship as having to be the same as nationalism? No, right? Like citizenship should be something maybe pragmatic or residency, let's say. So I agree with you. This is a big constraint, and obviously is also weaponized, right? By exactly saying you are not of this nation, even if you're supposed to be, and so on. So absolutely, this is at the core of much of the problems we deal with, and the core of governments then not allowing people to enter as refugees by saying, well, you have to be of our nation in order to be a full-fledged member of our society, and if you're not, then you're not going to jump over that hurdle. So I agree, that's absolutely at the core of it. Again, has been surpassed. I mean, look at political philosophy, Habermas's notion of constitutional patriotism, which underlies the EU, right? And the EU is a great experiment, actually, in a positive sense. I benefit from it. I can live and work in all the countries of the EU. I chose the one that fled the EU, but that's some sort of perverse masochism, maybe. No, but that's an example of where maybe constitutional patriotism in that Habermasian sense is a different way of conceiving of citizenship, which doesn't require, and at least there's one experiment looking at that, but yeah.
Thank you, Tariq, for such informative and inspiring presentation and comments in the Q&A. We hope your appetites are all more than whetted for a series of panels to follow, the first of which begins in 10 minutes, so feel free to mull around or get a drink of water, and we'll start up again in 10 minutes with our first panel on leadership and politics in the Global South. Thank you.